During my wife's special dinner with her lover, I walked over to their table and handed her the ring. She turned pale and immediately understood that this was the sign of divorce, without me having to say a word. I simply left the ring on the table and left with my dignity intact. She tried to call me that same night, desperate, but I had already closed the chapter. The lover, who seemed to promise excitement, disappeared weeks later, leaving her with the emptiness she created. Meanwhile, I found a new love, someone who looks at me with respect and builds each day by my side with truth. Months later, she sought me out, her eyes full of guilt. I forgave her. Not to start over, but to end things with ease. She moved on with regret, with the peace of someone who chose to move on. But what no one saw was the behind the scenes of all this. No one knew what it was like to carry that feeling in my chest that something was out of place, to arrive home and she wasn't there, to look at the empty coffee cup and wonder who she'd laughed with that day. To touch a body that no longer belonged to me, but that pretended it still belonged to me. Betrayal doesn't begin with hidden kisses or deleted messages. It begins in silence. In disinterest. In the gaze that passes over you like a wall. It begins when the person who claimed to love you no longer cares if you arrived safely, if you slept, if you dreamed. Betrayal is born in absence. And I felt it before I even saw her. Before I even confirmed anything. What happened that night at dinner wasn't the end. It was just the last page of a book she'd already been writing alone. She thought I didn't know. That I was foolish enough not to notice. But no one knows love like someone who's built it with their own hands. And I built ours with care, dedication, and truth. I knew her like no one else. I knew the rhythm of her breathing as she slept, the taste of her tea on cold nights, the way she bit her lip when she was nervous. I was home. I was refuge. But she wanted a storm. I found out by accident. As happens to almost everyone. A text message at an odd time, a photo with an abbreviated name, an excuse that didn't quite stick. She started going out more, smiling at her phone, coming back late smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. It didn't take long for everything to fall into place. But I didn't say anything. I swallowed hard. Over and over. I wanted to be sure. I wanted her to have a chance to come back. She didn't. Instead, she sank deeper. She became cold. Sarcastic. She started blaming me for everything. For being tired, for no longer feeling anything, for wanting something different. And then, one day, she said to me, "I don't know if I love you like I used to." Like I used to. As if love had an expiration date. As if it were normal to break a heart because you've grown tired of someone's taste. And so I decided not to ask for anything. Not to beg. Not to fight. I waited. Until I found the place, the day, the time. That dinner, between friends, that was, in fact, their meeting. I got there, saw them both laughing, she fixing her hair the way she did when she wanted to impress, he touching her hand as if she were some kind of trophy. I said nothing. I walked to the table. She saw me. Her color drained. Her eyes widened. The world seemed to stop for 3 seconds. I took the ring off my finger. Placed it on the table. She tried to say something. Maybe it's not what you think, but I had already seen it all. And in that silent gesture, in that dry sound of the ring touching the wood, I said everything she needed to hear. I left. For the first time in months, with the dignity of someone who knows they've given everything, but who won't accept less than they deserve. She called me that night. Many times. I didn't answer. She deleted messages before sending them. She stayed online and offline. But it was late. Too late. And the void she'd created for herself grew wider with each new dawn. Her lover was gone. Of course he was. He didn't want love. He wanted the taste of the forbidden. And when the forbidden became routine, he was gone. She was left alone. Surrounded by her own rubble. It wasn't punishment. It was consequence. The truth always takes its toll. Time passed. And I, with all the wounds she left, learned to walk again. It wasn't quick. Nor easy. I had to rebuild myself from the pieces she didn't want. But little by little, I cleaned the house, moved the furniture around, opened the windows. And one day, without rushing, I met someone. Different. Someone who didn't come to fill a void, but to build something new. Calmly. With respect. Without rushing and without games. A love that doesn't need to shout to be true. That doesn't promise a storm, but commits to the sunshine after the rain. A love that looks me in the eye and doesn't look away. A few months later, she reappeared. Her eyes filled with a regret that couldn't be contained in her face. She wanted to talk. To tell me she'd understood everything. That she'd made a mistake. That she'd lost me because of an illusion. She cried. She asked for forgiveness. She said she even missed my silence. But I wasn't the same anymore. I listened. I remained silent for a while. And then, with the serenity of someone who's suffered all there was to suffer, I forgave her. Not to return. But to end things lightly. Because carrying her resentment would be the same as continuing to give space to someone who didn't choose me when I was still whole. She went home with regret. I went home with peace. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, is that on that day she saw me with another woman, in that cafe I accidentally walked into and saw her looking at me from afar with eyes full of something she'd never shown before. That day she realized, with a lump in her throat, that she would never again be what she once was to me. And there, she lost more than a love. She lost the right to be a good memory. Because there are pains that teach. Others that heal. And there are pains, like this, that leave a lasting mark. What happened to her afterward, to him, to everyone, what really happened in the days between that dinner and my new beginning, all of that came out much later. The most shocking part of the story was not the betrayal. That's what came next. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize betrayal, we expose it. All stories are fictional, but based on emotional truths that many have experienced. Our goal is to show, without filters, how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and leaves irreversible scars on the souls of those who truly love. Brace yourself. What you're about to hear is a shocking, intense, and unforgettable story. They seemed like the kind of couple everyone pointed to and said, these two were made for each other. That's how they were seen, and for a long time, that's exactly how they felt. Friends said they were connected even by their looks, family members were proud of their respectful partnership, and there was a silent complicity between them that made anyone around them believe true love truly existed. His name was Daniel, hers was Emily. Two simple, ordinary names, but together they carried a story that, for years, seemed handwritten by some screenwriter in love with ordinary life, the kind that doesn't need grand events, just small, daily gestures to function. The touch of hands upon waking, the tea shared on cold nights, the habit of looking at each other silently in the middle of dinner and smiling at absolutely nothing. It was there, in the ordinary, that their love blossomed. They lived in a modest house with a charming porch and a garden that Daniel tended on Sundays. Emily, for her part, always left little notes around the house, sometimes on the mirror, other times in his pants pocket, as reminders that they were together, that they were part of something bigger. They didn't live a luxurious life, but they had peace, and that was always enough. They both worked hard, she as a manager at a home decor store, he as a technology consultant, and even with their busy schedules, they always made time for each other. It was common to see them cooking together to some nostalgic playlist, exchanging confidences over a spoonful of pasta and a sip of cheap wine. They often went out on Friday nights, even if it was just to walk to the square and talk about the week. For them, more important than the place was each other's presence. Daniel was a calm, patient man. He had a keen sense of observation and a silent but constant way of loving. He demonstrated his love in the details, in the coffee brewed just the way she liked it, in the warm towel he left in the bathroom for her after her shower, in the care he took to never go to sleep without kissing her on the forehead. Emily, on the other hand, was more intense, more talkative, full of ideas and dreams that sometimes seemed too big to fit into time. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and changed the energy of the place. She was decisive, proud of her independence, but also extremely affectionate with those she allowed into her world. And Daniel was that someone. She said he was her ground, and he said she was the fire that kept everything warm. They had their ups and downs like any real couple. Petty fights, arguments over trivial matters, days when silence crept in and lasted a little longer than it should have. But they always returned to look at each other with that tenderness that seemed to erase everything. Daniel had the ability to listen more than he spoke, and Emily, even on the most difficult days, found a safe place in him. There was a mutual trust, built on time, transparency, and respect for the story they were writing together. It wasn't a movie love, it was better, it was palpable. Real. The kind of love that survives routine, fatigue, and the challenges of everyday life. Their relationship was marked by small but meaningful traditions. Every year, on their wedding anniversary, they returned to the same restaurant where they'd had their first date. They ordered the same dish, sat at the same table by the window, and toasted not only what they'd built, but what they still wanted to experience. There was something magical about that constancy. And, at the same time, a certain weakness that neither of them could see. Stability, over time, became a thing of the past. What was once a cause for celebration became custom. And custom, without realizing it, began to replace surprise. But even with this slight erosion natural to the years, they remained there, side by side, sharing life with the ease of those who've chosen to be together. Daniel had a small circle of friends and enjoyed spending his free time reading or tending to the garden. He was a man of simple habits, and there was something noble in his way of loving. He believed in commitment, in the value of a given word, in the beauty of growing old with someone who knew even his flaws. Emily, on the other hand, was more social, enjoying new things, exploring places, and meeting people. She had a thirst for life that often contrasted with Daniel's almost unshakable calm. But this contrast was always what united them. They were opposites who complemented each other, and for a long time, they managed to maintain a balance between stability and adventure. In everyone's eyes, they were the example. And perhaps they even were. There was no betrayal, no lies, no scandalous fights. Neither of them ever considered giving up, at least not out loud. They respected each other, cared for each other, and even as time made things more automatic, there was still a mutual effort to keep the spark alive. Emily sometimes complained about the routine. She said she missed the feeling of newness, the euphoria of before. Daniel listened to her attentively, trying to find ways to surprise her, even in small ways, an unexpected dinner, a weekend trip, a gift left in her car with a handwritten note. He tried hard. But effort wasn't always enough to satisfy a restless soul. In recent months, their conversations began to change in tone. Emily seemed more distant, more absorbed in thoughts she no longer shared with him. She talked a lot about work, goals, pressures. Daniel, respectful as ever, didn't force intimacy. But he felt it. He noticed her absences, even when her body was still there. He noticed the way she looked at her phone and smiled to herself, the way she averted her eyes when he watched her. He felt the shorter hugs, the more formal kisses, the rush to finish dinner. Still, he said nothing. Maybe out of fear of hearing what he didn't want to hear. Or maybe because he still believed it was just a phase, and everything would pass. Emily wasn't a cruel woman. Quite the opposite. She had a big heart, a keen sensitivity, and a sincere desire to be happy. But the restlessness that began to grow within her grew greater than the memory of what they once shared. It wasn't heartbreak. It was confusion. An inexplicable desire for something new, even without knowing exactly what it was. She began to pull away without realizing it. And Daniel, because he loved her so much, began to keep quiet. He preferred to swallow his anguish rather than pressure her. Because I still had hope. Because he believed that true love could endure even silence. It was in this climate of emotional silence that the days dragged on. They still lived together, still shared the same bed, still exchanged pleasantries. But a chasm was opening between them, and neither of them quite knew how to bridge it. The once lively house grew quieter. The radio played less frequently, conversations became shorter, and even the smell of coffee seemed to change. Emily went out more. She said she needed time, space, air. Daniel stayed. He took care of the house, the details, what was left. Because, even without knowing it, he was still holding the pieces together with both hands. There was one particular night when Emily came home late, and upon seeing her come in, Daniel simply smiled and said, "You look beautiful today." She thanked him with a brief smile and went straight to the shower. He stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling like he'd lost something, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Sometimes, losing someone doesn't happen all at once. It happens over the course of days, trying to save something alone. And Daniel had been alone for a long time, even without realizing it. Even though he believed there was still hope. Emily, for her part, felt a strange emptiness. Something inside her screamed for change, for emotion, for something she couldn't name. And that scream grew louder and louder, until she began to distance herself from what she knew. Not out of malice. But out of a dangerous mix of dissatisfaction and need. Still, at this point in the story, everything was hazy. Everything could still be resolved. There was still time. At least, that's what Daniel wanted to believe. But the truth is that certain changes happen silently. They settle in the corners of the house, between unspoken words, averted glances, nights spent sleeping with one's back to the other. And once they settle, they take root. It was on this fragile ground that something began to grow. Something that would soon change everything. But for now, there was still silence. There was still a routine being maintained with effort. There were still promises, even if unspoken. And as Daniel looked at her and saw the woman he had given the best years of his life to, she gazed into the distance with a mixture of longing and doubt. And between those two gazes, one filled with love, the other filled with absence, was a story about to fall apart. But neither of them knew yet. The change didn't happen all at once. It was subtle. So subtle that, from the outside looking in, one could easily say nothing was wrong. But inside, everything had already begun to crumble. Routines, once safe and full of affection, became automatic. Conversations, once long and spontaneous, became practical, punctual, almost bureaucratic. Emily began spending more time away, citing work commitments, events, and meetings that stretched late. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't question it. He'd always been the type to trust rather than accuse, to listen rather than interrogate. But even in silence, he felt an increasingly strong sense that something essential was slipping through his fingers. He began to notice absences that hadn't existed before, in small oversights, like anniversaries or messages that had previously been full of affection and now boiled down to, "I'll be late, don't wait for me, I'm tired." And the more he tried to get closer, the more she seemed to run away. There was a growing distance in her eyes. A kind of weariness that didn't come from the body, but from the soul. He tried to hold on to what was left. He'd make her favorite coffee on Saturday mornings, call to see if she needed anything on the way back, suggest simple weekend plans, just so they could be together, like before. But she always had a ready excuse. Tiredness, a headache, a commitment. Even her clothes had changed. Her perfume, her hair care, her rush to get ready even on ordinary days. Daniel noticed everything, but kept quiet. Doubt began to haunt his thoughts in moments of solitude, but he pushed it away. He didn't want to believe it. He preferred to blame the routine, the stress, the weight of the years. Pretend it was just a phase. The days grew long and gray. At night, he lay in bed listening to the sound of the shower, the blow dryer, her footsteps around the room. And on his side of the bed, there was only silence. The same silence he swallowed every day when he wanted to ask, "What's going on?" but couldn't. The hope that she was just confused still outweighed the fear of hearing a painful truth. But something inside him already knew. And perhaps because of that, he began to observe. Unintentionally, he began to note patterns, memorize schedules, find small lies strange, like a place she said she was but didn't know the song that played there that night, or the name of the friend she supposedly had dinner with but who hadn't appeared on any social media that day. The contradictions began to emerge, one by one, like drops of poison. And the more he pretended not to see, the more they accumulated. One night, she left her unlocked phone on the living room table. She was in the shower, and he passed by it casually. But the phone vibrated, and on impulse, or survival instinct, he looked. It didn't take much. A notification at the top of the screen, a name saved with a star emoji, a phrase that said, "I can still smell you," that was enough to freeze everything inside him. His hands sweated, his breath hitched. He didn't need any more proof. He didn't need to hack anything else. He already knew. He just didn't know what to do with it. He held the information with the coldness of someone watching the world crumble for the second time. Because the first time was the day he began to realize he was in love alone. And now, here was confirmation. Emily was with someone else. Or at least, sharing what should never be shared. That night, Daniel said nothing. He went to sleep beside her, as he had on other days, but now with a weight in his eyes that no one could carry for him. His heart throbbed, but not with jealousy, with grief. He was mourning a marriage still alive on paper, but already dead in soul. In the days that followed, he observed her more closely. Every gesture, every fake smile, every time she hid her phone when she saw him. And everything hurt. But he still hadn't confronted her. He hadn't exploded. Because his pain wasn't impulsive, it was surgical. He needed to understand how far he was going. He wanted to know who the other person was. He wanted to know how long he'd been deceived. He began to piece together the puzzle. And the pieces began to fit together. One day, when he said he was going to visit his mother, Emily came out wearing a new dress, makeup, and perfumed. Daniel, with the calm of someone who no longer believed in anything, simply watched. When she left, he remained silent, sitting in the living room, staring at the door she'd passed through. And in that moment, something inside him shattered completely. The next day, he started going out more. He talked to people, reconnected with old friends, and sought to reconnect. Not for revenge, but for survival. He began running at the end of the day, filling the empty spaces in the house with small changes. And even with the pain, something began to calm inside him. It was as if, by facing the truth, he could finally breathe again. Until the moment came. A mutual acquaintance, unaware of anything, told him that he had seen Emily having dinner with a man at a new restaurant on the other side of town. Daniel thanked him and said nothing. But in that moment, I knew this was it. This was where it would all end. She chose a sober outfit, calmly fixed her hair, and put on the shoes she wore on important occasions. She grabbed her keys, put the ring on her finger, simply for symbolism, and left. She knew exactly where she would be. And when she entered the restaurant, she saw them from afar. Sitting near the window, laughing, sharing a glass of wine, as if nothing existed beyond that table. Emily seemed like a different person. Bright, alive, light. As if that encounter were the center of the universe. Daniel didn't feel anger. He felt pity. For the image, for the mistake, for herself. He walked to the table with firm steps. They didn't see him right away. When Emily realized he was there, she froze. Her face drained of color, her eyes widened, her hand trembling slightly on her cutlery. The man in front of her was confused, looking at Daniel as if waiting for an explanation. But he said nothing. He slowly removed the ring from his finger, placed it on the table between them, and looked into her eyes for a moment. There was no shouting, no scandal. There was dignity. There was an end. She tried to speak, perhaps to make up an excuse, but he had already turned his back. He walked out of the restaurant with the same firm step he had entered. And there, at that table where she believed she was living an adventure, stood the symbol of the marriage she herself had destroyed. She called him that night. Several times. She sent messages he didn't read. She cried alone, in the room where he was no longer. And for the first time in a long time, she realized what she had done. His silence haunted her like a scream. And the emptiness she had tried to fill with another name now became unbearable. But what she didn't know, is that the worst was yet to come. Weeks of absolute silence followed. Daniel didn't respond to messages, didn't return calls, didn't reply to emails. He left no room for doubt. The ring on the table had spoken for him. Emily tried to reorganize her thoughts, to find some explanation that would make her believe it was all still reversible, but all that remained was a dull echo of regret that hammered night after night in her head. The man she'd shared dinner with, the one who seemed so certain in her mind in moments of doubt, was gone. He vanished without warning, without a goodbye, as if he'd never existed. A dry message, days later, was all that remained. What did you expect? That I would take care of you after this? Emily stood paralyzed before that screen, finally feeling the first pang of true regret. And it was in this emptiness that she began to face the cruelest reflection of her choices. There were no more justifications. No escape. For the first time, she had to look at herself without filters, and the reflected image hurt more than any external judgment. Daniel, on the other hand, breathed a new air. Still hurt, yes, still rebuilding his own pieces, but each step away from her was a silent victory. He began to walk alone through the streets that used to be theirs, now at peace. He resumed forgotten hobbies, reconnected with people he had pushed away in the name of a relationship he believed would last forever. The silence that had once crushed him now gave him space to begin again. Until, weeks later, he crossed paths with someone who made him laugh again. It wasn't an overwhelming passion, it was different. It was light, it was secure, it was sincere. A woman who looked him in the eye with truth, without haste, without demands. And Daniel, without realizing it, began to allow something new to blossom within him, without the rush to rebuild what he had lost, but with the maturity to not repeat what had already hurt. As he advanced, Emily retreated. She tried to return to her routine, but everything seemed meaningless. The places she'd frequented with him now overwhelmed her with memories. The pillow beside hers always felt cold. Her words, once so confident, now trembled. Until she couldn't take it anymore. She wanted to see him. He wanted to tell her he understood everything, that he'd made a mistake, that he'd do anything to make it right. But when she found him again, she didn't find the wounded man she'd left that night. He found someone who had overcome. Someone who looked at her with serenity, not with hurt. And that, more than anything, broke her. She begged for forgiveness. With tears, with a choked voice, with the fragility of someone who no longer had any arguments. He listened to her silently, respected her pain, but didn't give her space. There was something in his eyes that screamed, "You're too late." But it was only after that, weeks later, that the real wound opened. Emily was at the supermarket when she overheard two women talking in one of the aisles. They were co-workers, acquaintances, and one of them, unaware she was there, commented with nervous laughter that the bombshell that dropped on the office that month was still going to pay off. They were talking about an internal scandal, about a woman who had unknowingly gotten involved with a man in a relationship, and about his wife who had found out and gone to the office to make a fuss. Emily froze. The blood seemed to drain from her face. She stood there, motionless, until the name she heard immediately afterwards knocked her off her feet. It was the name of her lover's wife. She was none other than Emily's direct boss. A woman who, until then, had always treated her cordially, who gave her opportunities, who trusted her. Everything made sense in that moment. The cold stares at work, the feeling of exclusion, the distancing from colleagues who had previously spoken freely. Emily had unknowingly gotten involved with her own boss's husband, and now it had all come to light. But that wasn't what destroyed her most. What truly crushed her was learning, right there in that supermarket aisle, that Daniel already knew. He'd known long before. And he'd never said anything. The revelation hit her like a punch. She sat in the car and stood there, frozen, her heart racing, her eyes watering, her breathing irregular. How did he know? How could he remain silent? How could you endure all of this and still act with such dignity? She returned home and spent the early morning going through old messages, emails, diaries, anything that could show exactly when it all began. That's when she found a letter. Unopened, unsent. A letter tucked among old documents, written by him. The date marked weeks before the night at the restaurant. The firm handwriting, though shaky in places, revealed the anguish with which he wrote. The letter wasn't accusatory. It was an outburst. He said he knew. That he had confirmed it. That he saw the name, the messages, understood everything. But he decided not to yell, not to humiliate, not to retaliate. That he would rather let her go in peace than bind her to a love that only he still held. And at the end of the letter, he thanked her. For everything they had shared. For the good years. For the love she once truly gave her. Emily broke down. She cried like never before. For the pain of betrayal. For the pain of loss. But, above all, for the pain of only now understanding the greatness of the one she destroyed. Time passed, but she was never the same. Work became unsustainable, friendships withered, the lightness she thought she'd find in another embrace never appeared. And every time I remembered the letter, every time I relived that night at the restaurant, a part of her shattered a little more. Daniel, for his part, moved on. He was more serene, more centered, stronger. The woman by his side didn't make him forget the past, but helped him write a dignified, clean, true present. A love built without leftovers, without lies, without secrets. And even after everything, even after the destruction, he held no grudge. Only memories. Some good, some not so much. But all buried in a time he no longer lived. His secret had turned against her. And now, she would live with the echo of loss, with the certainty that she was solely to blame for the absence of the love that once made her whole. Because some mistakes cannot be corrected. Some choices exact too high a price. And there are people who, once lost, never look at others the same way again. The night Emily found the letter was also the night she didn't know who she was in front of the mirror for the first time. The words Daniel had written without intending for them to be read were embedded like thorns in her conscience. It wasn't just that he knew. It was the way I endured it. The Maduro silence. The dismissal without scandal. The love that still bleeds chose not to make her bleed. Emily sat for hours on the living room floor, the letter pressed against her chest, feeling the air sliced into pieces inside her lungs. There was no longer room to justify anything. The guilt, which used to be camouflaged in attempts at self-indulgence, now had a name, a face, and a dignity that crushed her. Days later, and without having really slept, Emily appeared in front of Daniel's house. He hesitated at the gate for several minutes. He looked at his trembling hands, the cloudy sky, the closed windows. He rang the doorbell, unsure of what to say. It took him a moment to open it. When he did, his expression was serene, unsurprised. He was dressed simply, freshly shaved, and there was a gleam in his eyes that was neither bitter nor nostalgic. It was something else. Something she didn't remember seeing before. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice breaking. He nodded and opened the door. The house was different. Brighter, with new plants, without the old photos, without the remnants of the life they shared. She noticed. And that, without anyone saying a word, hurt him more than any scream. They sat in the living room. The same couch where they used to sleep between movies and wine. It felt cramped now. The air was thick, not because of tension, but because of the clarity of the ending. Emily swallowed hard. She searched for words, bit them off before letting them out. He finally spoke. I read the letter. I didn't know you wrote it. I didn't know you knew that. Daniel looked at her calmly, without interrupting. I didn't know who he was either. I didn't know he was married. He never told me. And when I found out, it was too late. I'm sorry. I'm more sorry than I can say. Daniel folded his hands on his knees. I know, he replied quietly. I found out later too. Your boss came to see me. To avoid complaining to me, he came to apologize. She didn't know either. No one knew. Only the two of you. Emily covered her face with her hands. Her crying wasn't shrill. It was a restrained sob, rough and dry, as if each tear was burning inside. Daniel stood. He walked to the kitchen and returned with a glass of water. He handed it to her without saying anything. She took it, trying to compose herself. I thought there was a part of me that wanted you to yell at me, she said, her eyes red. That you would hate me. Because that would have made me feel less like a monster. But what you did was worse. You treated me with a humanity I didn't deserve. Daniel sat down again, closer this time. He sighed. It's not about deserving, Emily. It's not about punishing. It's about setting boundaries. And you set those boundaries. I just respected them. She lowered her gaze. It wasn't just a fling. It was an escape. I wanted to feel something different. I felt alive. I felt wanted. And then, empty. So empty. He didn't answer. Not because I had nothing to say, but because he didn't need to. He had experienced emptiness long before. Are you with someone? She asked, more out of a need to know than hope. Daniel nodded, without elaborating. Yes. I'm building something. With time. With the truth. Emily closed her eyes. A gesture of resignation, of surrender. I don't want you to forgive me. That's not why I came here. I came here so you can hear me say what I never said. I was a coward. Selfish. Disloyal. And if you ever felt less because of me, I swear you'll hurt me every day of my life. Daniel leaned slightly toward her. I wasn't less. I was more. And that's what you couldn't see. And that's okay. I also didn't know how to tell you in time. There was a long silence between them. The kind that doesn't bother. The kind that seals pages. Finally, Daniel stood. He looked at her with a softness that wasn't love, but also not spite. It was peace. I forgave you a long time ago. But not to go back. To let go. She nodded, holding back the tears that still wanted to flow. Thank you, he whispered. For loving me well. For not returning with hate what I destroyed. Daniel walked her to the door. Before leaving, Emily stopped, without turning around. You know. Sometimes I wake up thinking you're still home. That you're going to make me coffee. That it was all a nightmare. And then I remember. And the day becomes a punishment. He said nothing. He closed the door softly. And that was the last time he saw her. As the months passed, Emily's life changed. She changed jobs, cities, environments. He tried to start from scratch. But there are gaps that can't be filled with distance. The nights were his penance. The letter, which he had photocopied before returning it, he reread as a reminder of what he was. Sometimes he thought about writing to him. Not going back, not begging for anything. Just to tell him that she still admired him, that she still dreamed of him. But she never did. He knew that on the other side of that story, there was no longer room for his voice. Daniel, for his part, learned to breathe differently. The woman now by his side loved him not for who he was, but for who he was in the present. He was no longer the man who placed peace above pain. He was now someone who chose not to stay where there was no reciprocity. He didn't speak of Emily again, nor did he relive the details of that night. But in his gaze, every now and then, a trace of something that wasn't sadness crept in. It was memory. One that didn't hurt, but taught. And that, in the end, was all that remained, a lesson written in scars, but read with gratitude. Their story ended long before they said goodbye. It ended in the small silences, the ignored signs, the lack of courage to face what was no longer there. But true closure came when they both, at different times, understood that there are loves that teach you how to love, only so you can do better, with someone else. Emily never fell in love again. Not like before. Not like with him. Because some mistakes are repaid not with punishment, but with absence. And Daniel, who was betrayed without deserving it, found his redemption not in revenge, but in living better. That was his victory. And that, the end of him. The air after a storm always seems thicker. The calm that comes isn't an immediate relief, it's a kind of suspension, as if the world were floating for a moment, unsure how to resume movement. It was like that for Emily. The days following her encounter with Daniel were confusing, slow, irreversible. She knew there was no going back, that words had done what they could, and that what remained unsaid would become the stuff of memory. But the pain didn't lessen. On the contrary, it was taking on a different form. It was no longer impulsive guilt, not the anguish of discovery, nor the desperation to recover something she knew was lost. It was something deeper, a bitter and precise awareness of what had truly been broken. Because it wasn't just about having betrayed someone who loved her, but about having betrayed the version of herself she once promised not to be. He began to see the world through different eyes. Everything that had previously seemed ordinary to him now took on a new weight. The couples laughing in coffee shops, the small everyday gestures, one hand in the other amidst a banal conversation. These scenes struck her with the force of the everyday that no longer belonged to her. Her daily routine had taken on a different tone. He began to question decisions he hadn't previously considered. The way I had stopped caring, stopped communicating, stopped perceiving the richness of simplicity. He understood that love doesn't fade just because it wears out, but because we stop nurturing it, because we begin to look outward at what we haven't cultivated within. Daniel, at the same time, didn't experience explosive happiness. His was a different kind of reconstruction. Quieter, more solid. I learned to cherish the moments of calm as if they were small triumphs. Their current relationship needed no comparisons, because it wasn't built on the ruins of the past, but on the new foundations he himself had decided to lay. Sometimes, when the silence of the house settled in, he thought about everything he had experienced. Not with longing or resentment, but with a kind of mature distance, like someone observing from the shore a city they no longer inhabit. And it was in that distance that he found his freedom. But even with this newfound peace, memory isn't a timer. Emotions, even tamed, have deep roots. So when one afternoon he received an invitation to a charity event organized by old acquaintances, he hesitated. Not out of fear, but because he felt he might once again encounter shadows from the past. Still, he decided to go. Because his life was no longer an escape. He wanted to face everything without owing anything. And it was precisely there that he saw her again. It wasn't a chance encounter. She was there, in the crowd, thinner, with a different air. He no longer projected the same kind of presence. She seemed restrained, discreet. Her eyes, however, still spoke with an intensity that didn't go unnoticed by Daniel. The greeting was brief, respectful. A small smile, a long, untouched look. Throughout the night, they exchanged only a few short phrases, surrounded by words left unsaid. But that passage was enough for both of them to understand that something, though closed, still vibrated in the air. It wasn't desire, it wasn't longing. It was something more complex, the recognition of a shared history that could no longer be repeated, but also couldn't be ignored. Arriving home, Daniel thought everything through clearly. There was no hatred. There was no pity. But he also understood something fundamental: he could forgive her once and 1,000 times, but that wouldn't make her part of his future. Emily, on the other hand, felt how that brief encounter had shaken her. She had seen him secure, present, whole. And that was exactly what she had lost by looking away at the time. She wondered how much longer she would live under the shadow of that mistake. And then the dilemma arose. Not to return to him, because she knew it was no longer possible, but to move on with this burden or transform it into something more. There was a part of her that wanted to disappear, start somewhere else, sever all ties with her previous history. But there was another, more mature part that understood that true learning doesn't lie in running away, but in looking at the damage and taking responsibility. It was then that she decided to seek out the wife of the man she'd been involved with. Not to apologize, she knew she might not be welcome, but to close the circle. The woman agreed to see her. The meeting was sober, without tears or recriminations. The other woman firmly told her that she no longer needed an apology, that she had rebuilt her life, and that the scandal of those days only made her stronger. Emily listened attentively, feeling small but also relieved. Because, for the first time, he understood that he wasn't the protagonist of an epic story, but responsible for a chain of consequences that affected far more than he imagined. This step, though symbolic, allowed him to move forward. He began giving talks in support groups, not from the position of victim or counselor, but as someone who speaks from the depths of his failure. He shared his experience without drama, intending to warn about the decisions made in silence, the small abandonments, the justifications he repeats to himself to avoid seeing what's breaking. He wasn't seeking public redemption, but meaning. He had found in that act a way to give value to a story he could no longer change. Daniel discovered some time later what she was doing. Not to herself, but to others. At first, he didn't know what to feel. But after thinking about it, he understood that this was part of his own process. That everyone deals with their wounds in their own way. And that perhaps, in the end, Emily had learned something too. He didn't contact her. I didn't need to. But deep down, a part of him recognized the effort. The new woman in his life, attentive and perceptive, asked him one night if he still thought about her. Daniel answered without hesitation. Yes, sometimes. But not with desire. Not even with pain. With gratitude. Because everything I am now was also built on what I overcame. She smiled. He took her hand. And there, without saying anything, they sealed something that needed no words. Thus, while one part of her past closed, another asserted itself with greater force. The story with Emily no longer had a place, but it wasn't an open scar either. It was a chapter already read, already understood, already forgiven. Emily began accepting social invitations again, resumed writing, and, though still lonely, no longer felt uninhabited. She had lost a love, yes. But she was also reconnecting with herself. She learned to live with the weight of her choices, but also with the freedom to be someone new. She was no longer seeking redemption from others. Her battle was internal. Her journey was now inward. Sometimes he'd look at an old photo he still kept. Not to pine, but to remember what shouldn't be repeated. Because he finally understood that some loves can't be recovered, that forgiveness doesn't always bring a return, and that second chances don't always come from other people. Sometimes, the only real second chance is the one you give yourself to avoid betraying yourself again. And as each took a different path, fate seemed to be preparing the final scene. One that doesn't seek to reconcile, but to close with meaning. Because every story that matters needs an ending that does justice to what was experienced. And that end was coming. Without drama. Without promises. But with the inevitable weight of everything that had already burned. Autumn arrived unhurriedly, dyeing the trees warm and melancholic tones, as if nature understood the end of one cycle and prepared for another. Leaves covered the sidewalks, and the gentle winds carried a silence that seemed to infiltrate every corner of the city. It was during this season that Daniel decided, for the first time in years, to take a trip alone. It wasn't an escape, but a silent farewell to everything he'd left behind. He rented a small house in a coastal town, far from familiar faces, far from the places that still held echoes of his old life. He carried with him only the essentials and, inside his suitcase, a single letter he'd never dared to burn. It wasn't resentment. It was a memory. And there was value in keeping that old pain as a marker of who he'd become. In the new city, the days began to pass with a different cadence. He walked the sand every morning, sat in small cafes where no one recognized him, and read books he had long left piled up unopened. The woman who now shared his life visited him on weekends, and with her, Daniel shared the silence, the glances, the new beginnings. She understood without needing to translate, didn't demand space, didn't demand cures. She was a constant and respectful presence, someone who knew how to love what existed now, without trying to take the place of what once was. It was one of those afternoons, while walking along the rocks by the sea, that he received an unexpected message. An unsaved number, a short text, "I'll be in town for a few days. If you can talk, let me know." The signature, Emily. Daniel took a few minutes to react. There was no anger, just mild surprise and, perhaps, a dormant curiosity. He didn't respond immediately. He spent the night wondering if that encounter made sense, if there was still something left to say. In the end, he concluded it wasn't about her. It was about him. About the right to finally close the last fragment of a story that, although concluded, still left shadows. They agreed to meet in a discreet park, far from the tourist-frequented cafes, where the sound of dry leaves underfoot was louder than any city noise. When she arrived, Daniel recognized her from afar, but not by her clothes or her face, but by the way she walked. Emily was different. More restrained in her gestures, less concerned about being noticed. When their eyes met, she simply smiled, a small, unassuming smile. He returned a discreet wave, and they sat on a bench beneath a nearly bare tree. For long seconds, neither of them said anything. There was a kind of silent respect between them that seemed to shield the moment from any thoughtless words. Emily finally broke the silence. "I didn't expect you to agree to see me. But I had to try." Daniel simply nodded, his eyes fixed on her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been going through an internal process for a few months now. I've tried to reinvent myself. Not to win you back, because I understand I no longer have that right. But to avoid repeating what I was." She took a deep breath and added, "And even though I didn't know if I should, I thought it would be fair to tell you something." Daniel kept his gaze steady, but there was something new in his expression, a mix of anticipation and weariness. Emily then told him she had started writing. Nothing published, nothing for others. Just accounts. A kind of diary where she tried to reconstruct with words the pieces she had destroyed with her actions. She said she had reread his letter more times than she could count. And that one night, after a talk she gave at a support group, she decided to write a response. Not to send, but to free herself. She held out an envelope, crumpled at the edges, and said, "I don't expect you to read it. But I needed to give it to you. Because this is the last thing I owe you." Daniel took the envelope gently, but didn't open it. He simply put it in his coat pocket. There was no rush. Emily didn't seem to expect any reaction. She simply breathed, looked around, as if absorbing every detail of that scene that would seal a cycle. "You know," she said softly, "for a long time I thought my punishment would be absence. Your absence. But I understood that the real punishment was realizing, every day, that I lost the only thing that was truly pure in my life. And that will never come back. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm. The absence you feel isn't mine. It's the absence of the woman you were when we loved each other. I lost something too. But I chose to move on without carrying the other's guilt. Emily nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you for that too. For not giving me back what I deserved. I think if you had, I would have become even worse. Daniel looked at her compassionately. It wasn't about being better or worse. It was about not becoming someone I didn't recognize. They both stood up almost simultaneously. There was no hug, no handshake. Just one last look, long, intense, necessary. And then, each went their separate ways, without looking back. Daniel walked to the beach, sat down on the sand, and there, finally, opened the letter. He read every word with the attention of someone seeking not justification, but understanding. Emily spoke of regrets, of losses that hurt silently, of nights when she woke with the weight of her own voice saying things she never should have said. She spoke of love. The real kind. The kind she recognized too late. And at the end, she wrote, I hope the woman by your side never needs to lose you to know who you are. I hope she sees you as I never knew how to see you. Daniel folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and let the wind carry it away. He didn't need to keep it anymore. It was already resolved within him. And as the sea whispered in the background, he understood that sometimes the true ending isn't an abrupt cut, but a slow, respectful closure, where each person finds their own peace. His was already there. And now, it was time to look only forward. Life went on as it always does, even after major earthquakes. But not all reconstruction happens at the same time, nor do all ruins transform into new structures. Some become scars on the ground, visible only to those who lived there. Months after their last encounter, each person's reality had shaped itself at different paces. Daniel, though still marked by everything that had happened, now breathed a different kind of air. The woman by his side had become more than a partner, she was his home. With her, he didn't need to be half of himself or hide old pains. He was whole. They lived simply, without grand declarations, but with small daily gestures that created a solid foundation, a healthy routine full of affection. Little by little, Daniel learned to smile without the weight of the past, to love without fear, and, above all, to recognize himself without needing anyone's validation. What struck him most wasn't the new love, but how much he himself had changed. That man who once swallowed tears in silence no longer existed. In his place was someone who knew his worth, who didn't beg for presents, who didn't tolerate crumbs. At a dinner with friends, as he listened to laughter around the table, Daniel realized something he had never felt so clearly: peace. It wasn't a happy euphoria, nor an unbridled passion. It was simply the feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, with whom he was supposed to be, without doubts, without fear, without ghosts. When he looked at the woman beside him and she simply smiled silently, as if reading his thoughts, he knew. It wasn't about forgetting what he'd experienced. It was about having found a way to live better, despite everything. The pain he once thought would last forever was now just a distant memory, one that no longer hurt, but that taught him every day how the right choice is rarely the easiest. Emily, on the other hand, followed a more tortuous path. The attempt to rebuild demanded more of her than she expected. She got a new job in another city, more remote, where few knew her and where she could try to be just one among many. She immersed herself in her work with an intensity that bordered on exaggeration. She maintained a rigid routine, filling every available hour with assignments, courses, readings, and events. Not out of ambition, but out of fear of stopping. Because she knew that, in the silence, the past still whispered. She tried a few brief relationships, but none prospered. Not because she was incapable of love, but because now, in everything she experienced, there was the shadow of an inevitable comparison. No embrace was as comforting, no gaze as transparent, no conversation as genuine as the one she once had with Daniel. In the early morning hours when sleep eluded her, Emily paced the dark apartment, reflecting on the choices she'd made. She no longer defended herself, no longer sought justification. She knew where she'd gone wrong, knew when she'd lost her way, and most importantly, she knew there was a point where returning was no longer possible. One of those nights, in front of the mirror, she tried to see herself as Daniel saw her. Not the woman she'd betrayed, but the woman he'd loved. And she cried, not out of guilt, but out of longing for herself. Longing for that version of herself that had been able to inspire such profound love. Time had taught her that not everything in life can be fixed, that certain mistakes remain with us like internal scars, and that, no matter how hard one tries, there are doors that, once closed, never open the same way again. Years passed. One day, while visiting the old city to take care of bureaucratic matters, Emily passed a square where she used to sit with Daniel. It was emptier, the trees taller, the bench a little worn. He sat there for a few minutes and watched the couples pass by. A woman fed pigeons with her husband beside her, two young men laughed through shared headphones, an older couple exchanged words silently with their eyes. Emily smiled slightly. Not with joy, but with understanding. She realized it wasn't the love life had denied her, but the love she herself had failed to protect. What had destroyed was more than a relationship. It was an entire story that could have lasted a lifetime if it had been nurtured with the attention it deserved. Across town, Daniel watched the sunset with his partner. They sat in silence by a lake, hands clasped together. He didn't know Emily was there. And even if he had, he might no longer feel anything. Because time has the power to heal what seemed incurable. He had rebuilt his life, not as a reaction to what he'd experienced, but as a conscious choice. Pain wasn't the last thing he felt for her, but forgiveness was. And forgiveness, as he'd learned, isn't meant to absolve the other, but to free oneself. Emily, in turn, left flowers on that park bench before leaving. Not as a ritual, but as a symbol. There was no name, no note. Just a silent gesture. It was her way of saying goodbye for good, of letting go of that piece of life that still held her captive. When he returned home that night, he looked in the mirror again. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't cry. Not because it hurt less, but because I was finally learning to carry it with dignity. Now, after all this, each character has gone their own way. Daniel found love where truth flourishes, Emily found truth where love died. And life, as it always does, went on. But with scars, with lessons learned, with definitive changes. If you've made it this far, tell us in the comments, what did you think of this story? What was your most memorable moment? Subscribe to the channel to continue hearing stories like this, those that touch, that provoke, that show the human side behind choices. And remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship. It destroys trust, identity, entire stories. It leaves unseen scars that transform those who bear them. Here on the channel, we do not support any kind of betrayal. Our goal is to show, through fiction, how thoughtless decisions can cost much more than imagined. Cherish those by your side. Protect the love you have. Because one wrong choice could mean the end of something you'll never find again.